The first rule when you're forced to disappear into a community run by petty tyrants is simple. You don't stand out, you become invisible, you turn into part of the scenery until it's time to show teeth. For months I lived quietly, deliberately ordinary, because staying unnoticed is the best armor against people who survive on control. But HOA Karen, swollen with power from her cheap title and brittle ego, decided my driveway was the perfect place to stage her dominance. She rolled in, parked across it as if she owned my house, and smirked like she was blocking access to some weak old neighbor too timid to challenge her. She thought it was intimidation. She thought it was a message. What she'd actually done, without the smallest clue, was step directly onto protected property and into a legal minefield that would blow apart everything she imagined she controlled. She believed she was inconveniencing a quiet resident. She had no idea she had just declared war on someone who had spent a lifetime enforcing laws far larger than her little binder of HOA rules. She thought this was going to end with me apologizing. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? She was about to find out that she had parked her car not just in the wrong driveway, but directly in front of the one person in the entire community who understood, down to the statute number, the federal protections wrapped around the land she was trampling. She had just challenged someone who could read property lines the way other people read street signs, and she was blissfully unaware that the driveway she casually blocked tied into regulatory authority that did not bow to HOA newsletters or board votes. She saw me as the quiet widower at the end of the street, the man who kept to himself and tended roses planted decades earlier. Someone she believed would rather comply than confront. She didn't know my past, didn't know that for decades my professional life revolved around drawing hard lines between what could be touched and what was untouchable, between private land and regulated waters, between personal ego and federal law. While she strutted around with a title printed on plastic name badges, I had spent a career issuing decisions that determined entire projects, rerouted developments, and stopped companies far more powerful than any HOA. She assumed silence meant weakness. In reality, it meant calculation. She was still busy enjoying her performance when I had already begun documenting, photographing, and assembling the first pieces of the case that would dismantle her authority, brick by brick. In her mind, she ruled this neighborhood through fear and fines. In mine, she had just crossed into territory governed by agencies that do not care about how loudly someone says policy. Her name around the neighborhood was always spoken with forced politeness and quiet frustration, but I use the only name that matters here, HOA Karen. She was the self-imposed ruler of the subdivision, fueled by petty control and self-importance, convinced that the HOA covenants were a personal crown instead of community guidelines. She weaponized them. She repeated phrases like standards and compliance, the way a child repeats a magic spell, and she genuinely believed that printing something in a newsletter made it real law. She walked with a permanent half-smile, the kind that wasn't friendly but condescending, the kind that told people she enjoyed being the one who decided what counted as acceptable. Parking in my driveway wasn't an accident. It was theater. She wanted everyone to see it, to understand that if she could block my home, she could do anything to anyone. But what she misread, what she never bothered to learn because arrogance doesn't study, was the land itself. Long before HOA Karen stapled her personality, this property had been surveyed, recorded, mapped, and wrapped in protections that didn't disappear just because she pretended not to see them. The creek behind my house was not a decorative feature in a brochure. It was a protected waterway tied into a system that placed it under federal jurisdiction, and the easements around it were not suggestions. She wasn't just trespassing. She was obstructing access connected to that protected zone, and each time she parked there, she layered violation upon violation with all the confidence of someone too ignorant to realize how deep she was digging. She thought she could invent rules to override reality. Reality was already documented and notarized before she ever arrived. She believed the HOA existed to enforce her moods. I understood it existed beneath county law, state statutes, and federal regulations that outranked every line of her bylaws. She rewrote neighborhood newsletters. I handled regulatory language that determined what governments and corporations were allowed to build. And when she decided my driveway was her personal parking space, she handed me exactly what she never thought anyone would have: a clear, unambiguous, provable starting point. From that moment on, there were no arguments, no debates about interpretation, no room for her favorite tactic of bullying through confusion. There were only facts, and facts are merciless allies. She assumed this story would end at an HOA hearing where she could talk over anyone who challenged her. Instead, it was destined to be recited in settings where speaking out of turn doesn't save you, and where the words underestimate and authority carry penalties measured in money, licenses, and silence. My driveway was where she chose to make her stand. It was also the place where everything she used to feel powerful would be taken from her, piece by piece. And from the moment her tires touched the concrete, the ending had already begun. She thought she was blocking in some random homeowner with a few weekend tools in the garage, but the reality she never imagined was that she had parked across the driveway of someone who had spent an entire career drawing hard legal lines on land and water that no one was allowed to cross. My life before this neighborhood wasn't defined by HOA meetings and petty politics. It was built in survey fields, regulatory hearings, federal projects, and courtrooms where words like jurisdiction, easement, and protected waterway aren't decorations. They are immovable boundaries backed by law. Long before HOA Karen appointed herself queen of cul-de-sac power trips, I had been working on infrastructure and environmental enforcement cases where one mistake cost millions and one signed decision could halt entire developments, which meant precision wasn't a preference for me, it was muscle memory. My background wasn't something I waved around to anyone. It was simply the reason I knew instantly that what she had done in my driveway didn't just bruise my pride, it triggered a chain of statutes she didn't even know existed. To everyone else in the neighborhood, I was the quiet one at the edge of the map, the person who waved politely, helped when asked, and spent long hours working alone in the yard. I liked it that way. Silence isn't weakness. It's freedom from noise you don't need. I had already buried a life once when my wife died, and after that I had no interest in neighborhood drama, gossip rings, or HOA theater. My time was divided between the memories built in this house and the consulting work I still did in my field, reviewing projects and compliance issues that crossed my desk because agencies and firms knew I would see the details others missed. The irony is that the one thing I valued most, staying out of everyone's way, was the very thing that triggered HOA Karen's obsession, because people like her can't stand what they don't control. She saw my quiet as defiance, my independence as an insult, and my refusal to attend her ridiculous mandatory HOA presentations as a threat to her authority. That's how bullies think. If you aren't clapping, you must be resisting. Meanwhile, everything about the land under our feet was already written, mapped, certified, and protected years before she ever printed her first violation slip. My father taught me to read plats the way some fathers teach their kids to read novels, line by line, symbol by symbol, until the entire story of a property lives in your head. That training didn't disappear just because I retired. It sat quietly until someone arrogant enough forced it awake, that someone was her. The house itself wasn't just real estate to me. It was history, built by hands I knew, anchored by markers I could walk to blindfolded, and bordered by a creek that carried legal weight far beyond this HOA's backyard politics. Every survey, every deed, every conservation note tied to this property was burned into my memory long before she parked in my driveway. But memory wasn't good enough for what was coming. I pulled everything again, line by line, not to reassure myself, but to prepare for what I already sensed was inevitable once she chose confrontation over common sense. She thought she was picking on a man. She was actually picking a fight with paperwork, maps, science, and federal jurisdiction she didn't respect because she didn't understand it. In meetings, she strutted like she owned the pavement, loved hearing herself recite policy in that condescending sing-song voice people use when they mistake authority for superiority. I let her talk. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. Because when you truly know where power comes from, you don't waste breath trying to convince someone pretending. You wait, you document, you build, and you let them keep digging until the hole they climb into is deep enough that the truth doesn't need to shout. By the time she finished underestimating, she wasn't dealing with a difficult homeowner. She was standing in opposition to someone who understood every inch of this land, every legal restriction hanging over it, and every channel required to make consequences real. That was my authority. Not attitude, not bluster, not a title invented in a clubhouse meeting. My authority came from law, experience, and a lifetime of decisions that didn't crumble when someone raised their voice. HOA Karen parked her car in my driveway thinking she'd blocked in a man she could push around. What she had actually done was give me the perfect starting point to dismantle her illusion of control piece by careful piece, until all that remained was the truth she tried so hard to bury under policy and threat letters. The longer I watched HOA Karen operate, the clearer it became that she hadn't simply inherited authority. She had built a small, mean kingdom out of paperwork, fear, and people's reluctance to fight back. She didn't run a community. She ran a compliance machine that fed on anxiety, where every neighbor learned to flinch at envelopes with the HOA letterhead, and every conversation carried the quiet calculation of what might be reported. She stacked committees with loyalists who didn't question her interpretations, people who liked feeling powerful by proximity, and she trained them to see violations the way hunters see movement in tall grass. Rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons, and she wielded them with the precise cruelty of someone who enjoyed the sound of "that's not permitted" more than the sound of her own name. Her board meetings were theater disguised as governance. She would sit at the head of the folding table like she was presiding over a courtroom, tapping her pen against a stack of citations, calling people dear and sweetheart in a tone that stripped the words of everything gentle. When frightened homeowners tried to defend themselves, she would smile, flip through pages she had already decided not to read, and remind them that it's all in the bylaws, as if a sentence buried on page 38 justified anything she wanted it to. The truth was simpler and uglier than policy. Most people just didn't have the time, knowledge, or emotional energy to fight back, and she knew it. She built her power not on law, but on exhaustion. I saw the pattern everywhere once I started paying attention. New families, elderly residents, single parents, anyone who looked least likely to push back, became targets for her enforcement sweeps. One week it was lawn height, the next it was mailbox paint, then it was garbage cans being visible for 3 minutes too long. Each fine arrived with a tone of official inevitability, and when people challenged her, they were met with something worse than anger, that cold, patient smile that said she had all the time in the world to make their lives smaller, day by day. Board members who questioned her suddenly found themselves buried in accusations of non-participation or failure to support community cohesion, until most either resigned or surrendered. Behind the scenes, she built an economy of dependence. Contractors she recommended just happened to appear in every solution she offered, and mysteriously, those same contractors won every bid connected to HOA projects. She wrapped it all in language about community improvement, while quietly ensuring every problem led back to a service she controlled. People didn't just pay fines, they paid tribute. They stopped decorating the way they liked, stopped planting what they wanted, stopped using their own driveways without wondering whether she approved. That is what abuse of power looks like in a neighborhood. Not flashing lights or sirens, but a slow erosion of normal life until fear feels like policy. Her real strength wasn't the bylaws themselves. It was the culture she created. Neighbors began policing each other, worried someone might report them first. Conversations lowered to whispers. Windows stayed closed. You could feel it in the air, this tightness that didn't belong in a place where children ride bikes and people water their gardens. And at the center of it all was HOA Karen, feeding off control, mistaking compliance for respect, not realizing that silence does not mean agreement. It just means people are waiting. I did not intend to become her challenge. She made me one the moment she parked in my driveway and tried to turn my property into a stage for her authority. By then, she had grown so accustomed to winning through intimidation that she didn't even consider the possibility that someone might not only resist, but understand exactly how her structure worked and how to dismantle it without shouting. Every abusive empire, no matter how small, eventually makes the same fatal mistake. It believes its own myth. She believed she was untouchable because no one had stopped her yet. What she didn't see was that every act of overreach she committed left a trail of signatures, dates, checks, and witnesses. A trail I was already following with the calm certainty of someone who didn't need to scare her to end her reign. Once I understood exactly how HOA Karen's power machine operated, I stopped reacting to her and started dissecting the structure she stood on, because the fastest way to end a tyrant's confidence is to pull away the paperwork she hides behind and replace it with the paperwork she can't outrun. I didn't argue with her emails, didn't attend her little ambush hearings, and didn't bother trading sarcasm in the cul-de-sac. I went quiet, and in that quiet I did the one thing she never expected. I verified everything. I began with my own property like a battlefield commander walks terrain before a fight, slowly, methodically, with tape measures, photographs, and copies of every legally recorded document tied to my land. I pulled my deed, the master plat, the original surveys, the easements, the notes on the creek, and the riparian buffer restrictions, and I didn't stop with the summaries. I read every line, every footnote, every boundary mark. The more I read, the less theoretical this became. My driveway wasn't simply inconvenienced. Her car had repeatedly obstructed lawful access across an area directly tied to protected land use restrictions, which meant each smug visit in that white car wasn't just rude. It was documented trespass layered on top of violations she was incapable of even naming. From there, I widened the lens. I spent hours at county records, scrolling through microfiche that hadn't been touched in years, reviewing the original incorporation filings of the HOA she worshipped like scripture, and that's where the fractures. Buried inside the foundational documents she constantly quoted, but clearly never read, was language stating that every bylaw, every covenant, and every policy adopted by the HOA was subordinate to pre-existing easements, municipal law, state statute, and federal regulation. In one paragraph, written decades before she showed up with her clipboard, everything she tried to wield as ultimate authority was legally placed beneath the very regulations she laughed off as irrelevant. That wasn't an opinion. That was recorded law. I made certified copies of everything, stamped and sealed, because facts are heaviest when they... Then I followed the money, because dictators, even neighborhood ones, always leave a financial trail. I requested expenditure breakdowns, landscaping contracts, vendor invoices, and beautification project budgets. And what I found matched every frightened story I had heard whispered over fences. The same contractors appeared again and again. Companies just happened to be recommended. People work were inflated to absurdity, and those projects lined up with the residents who had fought her or questioned her. I documented each one, attaching dates, checks, and signatures, creating it even be arrogant enough to pretend didn't exist. While the documents told one story, the people told another, and together they formed proof that didn't need me to embellish a single word. I sat at kitchen tables while elderly neighbors explained how she had fined them into panic and then offered help if they used her preferred services. I listened to young families describe violations that appeared only after they declined to attend her meetings or refused to praise her plans. No one whispered anymore. They spoke clearly because I wasn't asking for gossip. I was asking for sworn statements, and they gave them. I had photos of her car in my driveway on multiple dates and times, time-stamped and backed up. I had audio of her threatening additional measures if people didn't comply. I had emails where her polite veneer cracked just enough to reveal the pressure tactics underneath. Every file went into an organized archive, cross-referenced, and backed up in 3 places. Because when you intend to end someone's rule, you don't rely on outrage. You rely on evidence. Discovery wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, relentless, and thorough. The steady gathering of every fact she thought would stay buried under fear and apathy. By the time I was finished, I no longer wondered whether she had crossed the line. I held an unbroken record showing that she had not only crossed it, she had danced on it, paved over it, and written citations on top of it. And the most satisfying part wasn't anger or anticipation. It was the absolute calm that comes with knowing that the moment you decide to act, the truth is already loaded, documented, irrefutable, and waiting to be placed where everyone can finally see it. Confrontation didn't begin with shouting. It began with the simple act of putting everything I had gathered in a place where HOA Karen could no longer pretend it didn't exist. The monthly meeting was supposed to be another one of her performances, where she would lecture, threaten, and bask in the nervous silence she mistook for respect. But the air that night felt different, because fear was no longer the only thing in the room. She walked in wearing that same smug smile, clipboard tucked to her chest like a badge of office, already rehearsing the fines and punishments she was going to unload, completely unaware that the script she'd lived on had already been burned. She opened with her favorite phrases: non-compliance, community standards, failure to cooperate, and every word rang hollow because the audience she thought she owned wasn't shrinking. They were watching. When she finally called my name, expecting me to shuffle forward and beg her for leniency, I didn't bring excuses. I brought the record. I spoke calmly, without drama, listing dates, citing deed restrictions, reading exact language from federal and state regulations she had bulldozed over with the confidence of someone who believed nothing above her existed. Each sentence landed with the dull finality of a hammer on steel. I laid out photographs of her car blocking my driveway, certified copies of easements that outranked every bylaw she ever waved at people, evidence of retaliatory fines, vendor kickbacks, and harassment cloaked as policy enforcement. And the room went so still you could hear paper shift under her fingers. She tried to laugh it off at first, tried to dismiss it as misinterpretation. But the problem with pretending to be in charge is that the act unravels the moment real authority walks up through the door, and that was the moment two quiet stepped inside. They weren't loud. They didn't posture. They simply carried folders and credentials. And when they introduced themselves, the titles alone erased every ounce of bluster she had left. Questions followed, not about lawn heights or mailbox paint, but about jurisdictional violations, environmental impact, financial irregularities, and the destruction of protected zones tied to the very land she had been so casually trampling. She stumbled over her answers, tried to redirect, tried to blame confusion, but confusion doesn't sign contracts, doesn't issue fines, doesn't park repeatedly on protect while smirking at the person who owns it. Every excuse collapsed before it finished leaving her mouth, not because anyone argued, but because the documentation already answered. Neighbors she bullied for years finally found their voices. One after another they stood, steady, unshaking, telling their stories out loud with a clarity that didn't need embellishment. And with every test, the image she built of herself as the righteous guardian of standards dissolved into what it had always been, control for its own sake. You could see it hit her in waves. First disbelief, then anger, then the dawning icy comprehension that she was no longer running the room, and never really had. Her board members, those who once echoed everything she said, sat pale and silent, suddenly realizing that their signatures were on the same decisions, and that loyalty to her might cost them far more than discomfort at a meeting. The beautiful thing about collapse is that it rarely arrives dramatically. It happens piece by piece until there's nothing left holding the structure up. By the time the meeting ended, she wasn't issuing orders. She wasn't threatening, lecturing, or smiling that thin, superior smile. She was quiet, not out of courtesy, but because for the first time since she crowned herself queen of this neighborhood, she had been forced to stand in a room where fear didn't work, and law did. The power she'd drunk from for so long was gone. Not seized, not stolen, just gone. because no one believed in it anymore. She left without her usual entourage, shoulders tight, gaze fixed anywhere but on the people she used to tower over. That was the moment of public collapse. Not yelling, not chaos, just the cold, humiliating awareness that the empire she built on intimidation had been reduced in a single evening to what it had always secretly been: nothing at all. Retaliation wasn't rage, it was precision. And the most devastating thing I did to HOA Karen was refuse to play in the emotional sandbox where she'd ruled for years. Because instead of shouting or trading insults, I turned everything she had done into formal action. The kind that comes on letterhead she can't ignore, and deadlines she can't talk her way past. And I did it methodically, the way you dismantle a structure you've already mapped from foundation to rooftop. I took the archive I had built, every photograph, affidavit, financial record, transcript, regulation, survey, and email, and converted it into coordinated filings with agencies whose authority made hers look like a child's game, submitting complaints to regulatory bodies, state licensing authorities, environmental enforcement, consumer protection, and civil courts all at once, so there would be no safe corner left for her to retreat into while claiming misunderstanding. I named her personally wherever the law allowed, not just the HOA shell she hid behind, because power without accountability is what made her cruel, and accountability means her own signature, answering for her own actions on paper she can't shred. As those filings went out, the tone of the letters arriving at her door changed from chirpy HOA notices to formal demands requiring documented responses under penalty of law, and the weight of real consequences began stacking on her porch with every certified envelope she had once loved to send to others. Contractors she'd used to punish residents suddenly found themselves confronted with questions about billing and kickbacks, and their loyalty evaporated the moment investigators mentioned audits, while board members who once parroted everything she said began scrambling for lawyers, realizing her shadow didn't protect them anymore. It implicated them. Simultaneously, my civil suit advanced, detailed, unemotional, and devastating, listing every retaliatory action, every fraudulent lien, every destroyed plant, every obstruction of access, translating her arrogance into damages measured in money and legal judgments rather than fear. Through it all, I stayed quiet and steady, because the point wasn't spectacle, it was consequence. And the system I had engaged doesn't yell, it processes. And once it begins, it doesn't stop because someone panics. For the first time since she started her reign over the neighborhood, HOA Karen discovered what it feels like to be on the receiving end of authority she can't intimidate, charm, or outtalk. And as the investigations widened and the silence from her supporters grew heavier, she finally understood that the man whose driveway she had chosen as her stage hadn't just fought back. He had done so like an expert who knew exactly which levers to pull, so the structure fell in on itself with perfect, unavoidable inevitability. Victory didn't arrive with applause or confrontation. It arrived quietly, like a door closing that will never open again. And by the time HOA Karen realized it, every avenue she used to dominate people had already been sealed shut. The investigations concluded not with speculation, but with findings, the kind written in unemotional language that lists violations, penalties, revocations, and fines with surgical clarity. And her name appeared in places she once believed she controlled, now attached to words like restitution, suspension, personal liability, and permanent injunction. The liens she had thrown around like threats were voided one by one, the fraudulent fines erased, and the neighbors she had cornered for years finally stood straight again, without asking permission from the person who once pretended to own their peace. Bank accounts were frozen, licenses were pulled, contracts were canceled, and the HOA she had twisted into her personal weapon was stripped down, audited, and dissolved, not through drama, but through paperwork that simply declared it unfit to exist in the form she created. She stopped sending emails, stopped calling meetings, stopped walking the neighborhood like a patrolling warden because the structure that made her feel enormous was gone, And without it, she was just another resident with no authority and a long list of consequences to face alone. The neighborhood changed in ways that didn't need announcement. Conversations came back to the sidewalks. People reopened curtains. Kids played in yards without worrying about citation letters. And the air finally lost that tight, watchful feeling she had poured into it. My driveway stayed clear, my access unobstructed, my property respected not because she approved, but because her approval no longer meant anything to anyone, or anything that mattered. I didn't gloat, didn't chase her, didn't bother with revenge speeches, because nothing I could have said would equal the silence around her now. The kind that follows someone who built their identity on fear only to find that once fear disappears, so does the person who depended on it. The last time our paths crossed, she saw me, froze for a moment, and then looked away, not with anger, not with words, but with the small, stunned realization that she had created the end she was now standing in. There were no final arguments, no dramatic scenes, just the steady reality that her power trip had ended completely and permanently. The street was calm, the house was mine, the rules had returned to what they were always meant to be, and HOA Karen, who once believed she ruled everything she could walk past, had nothing left to say.